So thank you so much, and hello everyone. So I'm Amanda Wood, a researcher at the Stockholm Resilienscentrum. And today I wanted to set the scene and give the big picture for your discussions about sustainable food, and in particular describe how sustainable food systems can be a very powerful way to support healthy people and healthy planet at the same time, as we've already heard from both Kaisa and Tobias this morning. So healthcare professionals are a really crucial part of the food system, but it's often overlooked just how powerful your role can be in supporting these sustainable food systems. So I want to thank you for inviting me to join you today so that we can explore some of these linkages between the healthcare sector and our work on sustainable food systems. So first of all, just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is a food system and where do healthcare professionals fit in? So a food system is considered all of the people, the activities, all of the elements that relate to food as it goes from farm onto your plate and then back through waste. So it includes this biological system, which provides the resources for what we need, the farming system, the value chain, embedded in the economic system, all of the political decisions that shape our food system, our social system that regulate the norms and values around food. And then we have the healthcare system, your domain. And you're the ones who see firsthand either the beneficial or the detrimental impacts of our diets. So today I'm really going to highlight these two parts of the food system because right now in Sweden, but also around the world, these two parts of the system in particular are feeling a heavy burden from our current dietary choices. So starting with the big global picture, we see that health and environment aren't just feeling what you could say a heavy burden, but you could say that we are in crisis. So we are in a global nutrition crisis contributing to a health crisis where millions aren't getting the key nutrients they need for a healthy diet. Millions are going hungry every night and billions are overweight or obese. And in fact, every world region is suffering from at least one form of malnutrition, including the Nordics, where overweight and obesity are big problems. So food is driving poor health around the world. And of course, we can't really talk about a global health crisis right now without talking about the pandemic. So what does food have to do with the COVID-19 crisis? Well, from the nutrition perspective, of course, those who are undernourished with compromised immune systems have a harder time fighting off diseases like COVID-19. But we've also seen that obesity, diabetes, and other chronic diseases associated with these unhealthy diets increase the risk of complications from the virus. So food is contributing or worsening to this public health crisis. And then at the very same time, we're in the midst of an environmental crisis, not just a climate crisis, but an environmental crisis. So negative environmental change, such as freshwater depletion, biodiversity loss, deforestation, rising CO2 emissions, or nutrient pollution, these are all happening at a really alarming rate. And food systems are the single largest driver of this environmental change as a whole. So food systems are really driving this environmental crisis. So why should healthcare professionals really care about the environmental crisis part? Well, if we do take pandemics as an example, since they are top of mind right now, this figure lays out some of the pathways that our current food systems are paving towards even more pandemics in the future. So we know that food systems are a huge driver of land use change, forcing wild animals to live closer to humans, along with our intensified agricultural and livestock production. And both of these things heighten the chance of diseases forming and spreading from animals to humans. And in addition, I think this was already mentioned, agriculture uses a large proportion of antibiotics, leading to antimicrobial resistance. So in short, our poor relationship with the planet is only expected to send more patients your way because we are really seeing that to have healthy people, we need the foundation of a healthy planet underpinning. So even if avoiding another nightmare pandemic would be enough, the linkages between food, health, and the environment run much deeper. I won't go too much into this paper because it will be talked about in depth, but I just wanted you to consider some of these examples of the food, health, environment nexus. So with increasing environmental change, we can expect that food supplies could be compromised as droughts or rising temperatures or other extreme events would lower the amount of food that we can produce or our yields. And this could make healthy food more expensive, leading towards shifts to unhealthy foods and in turn diet-related illness. And you may be thinking, yeah, but this won't happen in the Nordics. We won't have these environmental crises in the Nordics. But we really need to think again about that because we do import around 50% of our food in the Nordics. So these environmental crises around the world are a threat to our food supply as well. We are embedded within the global food system. Another example is changing temperatures or carbon concentrations can actually reduce the nutritional quality of food, leading to deficiencies that then have to be dealt with in your healthcare sector. And as a last example, rising air temperatures from climate change could increase obesity as people decide to be less physically active. So in short, the burden on the healthcare system is only expected to rise if we do nothing to address these interlinked challenges of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. But I would also like to expand that out to environmental change more broadly. And we'll touch on that in just a minute. So what do we do about these interlinked crises that we are facing? And can we use food systems transformations to result in both healthier people and a more sustainable planet? And that's exactly what this other Lancet Commission report looked into, the EAT-Lancet Commission. And the first part of understanding if we could have healthy people, a healthy planet, was to define what do we really mean by a healthy diet and sustainable food systems. So the Commission produced two sets of targets, the first being what is a healthy diet? So this middle column here will show the Commission's recommendations for a healthy diet. And these numbers in orange are often the numbers that show up in media or so forth. But I just want to draw your attention to all the numbers in parentheses. So the diet proposed by the EAT-Lancet was actually consisting of these ranges, healthy ranges of food intakes. And this is important, of course, since diets need to be adjusted to regional preferences, cultural traditions, and then, of course, individual health needs. And then the second set of targets, we also needed to define, well, how can that healthy food be produced sustainably? So what is sustainable food production? So we looked at 6 different Earth system processes, not just climate change, but land system change, freshwater use, nutrient use, and biodiversity loss, because these are the 6 Earth system processes that are most affected, but also influence greatly the food system. And then we put a global boundary on each of those Earth system processes, representing the total environmental pressure that can result from global food systems. But of course, these were on a global scale, and I'll come back to how we translate that to a more regional scale in just a few slides. But then to answer our question, is this possible? We had to put these two together, and we tested a range of different scenarios to see if we could satisfy both sets of targets. So we looked at how we vary the way we produce food, the way we waste food, and the way we eat food up to 2050. BAU here stands for business as usual. And here you see the 6 environmental indicators. Red means we're within, outside of the sustainable threshold, green we're within, and yellow we're still within some sort of safety or uncertainty buffer. So I don't want to go into all the details of the scenarios on this slide, but just draw your attention to the bottom line. So quite literally, the bottom line was that it will take the most ambitious improvements to production, at least having our food loss and waste, and a dietary shift in line to the EAT-Lancet ranges, But if we do those three things in combination, it will be possible for us to deliver diets that are good for people and the planet by 2050. So if it is possible for food to deliver on these health and environmental co-benefits, how do we actually put this global analysis into practice, for example, here in the Nordics? So we did do an analysis to see how diets in the Nordics would need to change to satisfy these EAT-Lancet targets. And first, we looked at what we eat in the Nordics and compared that to the EAT-Lancet. So the colored bars represent what we consume in 4 Nordic countries. And these green shaded regions represent the EAT-Lancet range. The dotted line would be the average value that was represented in orange. So basically, anytime the bars are within the green shaded region, we're within the healthy eating range proposed by the EAT-Lancet. So we can see that we are in line with some of these recommendations, but we see by far the biggest gap between what we consume today and what the EAT-Lancet recommends is for red meat, so much so that we had to put it on a different scale here. But we also can't lose sight of the fact that we are also eating too many added sugars, not eating enough legumes and nuts, not eating enough vegetables, and the grains that we are eating, most of them, or not enough of them, are whole grains, but they are refined grains. And of course, this is then reflected back in the data showing the largest dietary risk factors for Sweden, notably our low intake of foods like whole grains and legumes, but also our high intake of red and processed meat, snacks, for example, that are high in sodium, and then also low consumption of, for example, fibrous foods such as fruits or vegetables. So what kinds of poor health are these current diets responsible for? In Sweden, these poor diets are responsible for about 37% of deaths from type 2 diabetes, 1/3 of deaths from cardiovascular disease, and in fact, unhealthy diets as a whole are the 3rd leading risk factor for poor health in Sweden. So these diets, as I'm sure you're all aware, are taking a toll on individual health and also putting pressure on the healthcare sector. But these same diets aren't that great for the environment either. So this figure looks at the environmental impacts of Swedish consumption, so everything we eat here in Sweden. And we see these 6 indicators for environmental sustainability that were assessed in the EAT-Lancet. And the red ring, this smaller red ring in the center here, indicates a threshold for sustainability. So anything beyond that red ring poses an increasing threat to the environment. And then the wedges show the environmental impact from our consumption. So you'll immediately see that all of the wedges, except for water use, are outside of that red ring. So what we consume in Sweden is considered beyond a sustainable threshold for biodiversity loss, for greenhouse gas emissions, for cropland use, and for nutrient application. And we can take a closer look at the foods actually pushing us beyond those sustainable levels. So for greenhouse gas emissions, animal products as a whole, so this is meat, dairy, and fish, are accounting for 2/3 of our climate impact. The same product category is accounting for 60% of our cropland use, and then 77% of nitrogen application. Then if we looked at some of the other boundaries, we see that things like sweets and snacks, which are high in sugar and salt, and drinks, also often high in sugar, are pushing us beyond other environmental boundaries. So these same foods seem to be bad for our health and bad for the planet, particularly this high intake of red and processed meat and high intake of snacks with lots of sodium. But then we also have to look at foods that we aren't consuming enough of, like whole grains and legumes. And legumes in particular are really good for the environment. So we're eating a lot of things that aren't that great for the environment, and we're not eating a lot of things that could reduce the burden on the environment. And then, of course, we have to talk about how much we're eating. So unhealthy diets are contributing to overweight and obesity. Around the Nordics, it's about 50% of adults overweight or obese, and about 1 in 7 children. So I think this was already mentioned, but this does, of course, come at a not just an individual cost, but it has an actual price tag. And so obesity prevention would be key if we want to free the healthcare sector from dealing with these complications of overweight and obesity, but also just spend our money differently rather than treating obesity, but using it for more preventive measures. And then obesity also has links with the environment. So remember back a few slides, I mentioned that increasing temperatures could drive increasing obesity, but obesity is then already contributing to climate change. So the total impact of obesity from just one estimate is about 1.6% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions. And these are things these are due to factors like greater metabolic demands or more food production because of more food intake or transportation and so forth. So obesity is both driven by and driving climate change. So let's move to looking at what we need to change in our diets. And that would be adding about 1 portion of vegetables to our plates each day, and really swapping out quite a few of our red and processed meat portions, about 4.5 to 9 times across the Nordics. Swapping these out with other plant-based sources like the nuts and legumes that we need to increase about 10-fold to reach the EAT-Lancet recommendation. And then, of course, also making some swaps, like moving from animal-based fats to plant-based fats, eating more whole grains, and doing all of this within a proper energy balance. And what could we gain from this? Well, in terms of health outcomes, there's many, but I'll focus here just on reductions in premature mortality. And we see that shifts to the EAT-Lancet diet would reduce premature mortality about 22 to 26% across the Nordics. So this Nordic bar for each country indicates a reduction in premature mortality if the population shifted to the Nordic dietary guidelines, and then the EAT-Lancet bar is if they shift to the EAT-Lancet dietary guidelines, or sorry, diet recommendations. So you can see that these are pretty similar, and we're hovering, as long as we're shifting our diets to healthier diets, we're reducing premature mortality quite a bit. And reports like this Future Nordics Diets report have also shown that it's possible to produce nutritious foods that also greatly reduce our environmental impact. So this report tested a few different scenarios of moving to healthier diets, notably reducing our animal source food intake. And they showed that we could, for example, cut our greenhouse gas footprint by half or even greater, depending on which scenario they used. So the bottom line really is that diets are a key lever for supporting both healthy people and a healthy planet. And we do know what this win-win diet is. So we know that fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains have positive health impacts and very low environmental impacts and should make up the basis of this diet. But also roots and tubers, nuts and vegetable oils have positive and medium health impacts with relatively low environmental impacts. Then we have more limited amounts of ultra-processed food and animal source food, which both have medium impacts on the environment and health. And what we can see is that we are really limiting our processed meat, which is not good for the environment and not good for our health. Of course, we also wouldn't recommend added sugar, as it is not good for our health, and also just using environmental resources that we could use to grow healthier food. Seafood is a positive health impact, but high environmental impact. This one is actually a bit more difficult because it represents such a huge category of foods, so thousands of plants and animals, all with very diverse environmental and health impacts. But there are a few major commission reviews in the pipeline that will look at this in more detail. So what can you do? So pushing to get nutrition and food systems into the medical curricula, along with training packages to help equip all health professionals with the knowledge and skills to carry out, for example, dietary assessments and provide counseling on planetary health diets is important. And I'm hearing more and more that planetary health is coming into medical school education, and I see that as a very exciting development. And of course, today is a great sign. Also, we can look at where we are as individuals, look around our own environment, and that's what we can do. And we can ask that the food procured and served in the hospitals and healthcare facilities where we work is in line with a planetary health diet, and that it is minimizing food waste. And then the last is driving advocacy efforts. So promoting this agenda wherever you can, unions, colleges, and then of course associations like these. So just a few takeaways from today, this very high level overview. So we know that moving to a planetary health diet will help us reduce diet-related non-communicable diseases, overweight and obesity in Sweden, relieving the burden on individual health, the healthcare sector, and the economic burden. At the same time, we know that this planetary health diet will help us reduce our environmental impacts on so many different dimensions, climate, biodiversity, land use, nutrient application. And we know what this win-win diet is. So as I was describing, this diet includes really a variety of plant-based foods, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and whole grains, alongside smaller portions of animal source foods. And finally, because you interface with the entire population, so everyone has access to healthcare in Sweden, you as healthcare professionals are key to driving and monitoring this dietary change across the public. So I was very encouraged to hear about this, this day today. And again, thank you so much for having me join. So I'll stop sharing now.
Wonderful, Amanda. Thank you very much.
Tack så mycket, Amanda. Thank you. Jag kan påminna alla om att ställa frågor i chatten. Vi har lite tid avsatt nu. Amanda kommer inte att vara med vid den senare frågeställningen. Så ställ era frågor i chatten. Amanda, we have one question from Staffan Morild. He asks, the extreme ranges, the minimum and maximum recommended intake for the Eat Global diet, are they all safe and compatible with a good health?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I think this has been not that well understood in the media when this has been presented. So the EAT-Lancet diet ranges were constructed just based on nutrition and health considerations. So there is not sustainability in that healthy diet. So actually we need to look at the other way around. So yes, those ranges do promote good health, and there was a quite big nutrient and health analysis that underpinned that we just didn't have room to place in the EAT-Lancet report, but it did have quite a massive nutrient and health analysis to make sure those dietary ranges did satisfy those criteria. But actually what we need to look at is perhaps we tested a few diets within those ranges to see if they did meet these environmental targets as well. And for example, those orange values do, and I think they did some sensitivity analysis to check other diets. But of course, if we are eating at the maximum of all of these environmentally intensive foods, so if everyone is eating at the maximum of meat and dairy and all of these very environmentally intensive foods, then we have to then check again to see if those are falling within the environmental boundaries. So it's actually sort of flipping around your question that we need to look at it the other way, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Then we have one question from Hans Lingfors. What about vitamins and minerals in the Eat Global diet?
Yeah, so there was a nutrient analysis that went and underpinned this, and I think I'm not sure, I would have to go back and check, but it's actually the Springman paper in Science from 2018, I believe, that might have that nutrient analysis in the SI material, so you can dig into that. But from what I remember, we didn't have room in the EAT-Lancet report to include that nutrient analysis. But it was done, and Marco Springman was the one doing a lot of this modeling. He's published quite extensively and uses this quite a lot. I think he's also published in Lancet Planetary Health using similar types of data. So I would check out those publications from him to see if the SI material gives more specific details on his nutrient analysis.
Okay, thank you. And we will make sure that we will publish that when you send it. We have one question from Stella Sisinski. Obviously, we have problems with nuts and other imported food. Could you please comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So we do know that we have quite a big outsourced impact of our diets. So for example, about I think it's about 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions from our diets. I think it's around 50% of land use and about 90% of our blue water use is actually coming from these imported foods, so that environmental impact is somewhere else in the world. So we do know that there is a problem with imported foods. We also know that there are, of course, some tension points with what is healthy and what is sustainable. You could see some of those in the grid, where nuts, for example, have a bit of a higher environmental impact, even though they are over there in the positive health impact category. So I think we have to remember that nothing is an all or nothing here, which was a bit of a contradictory statement, but food is not an all or nothing thing. So of course there are some problems with nuts. The classic example here is getting cashews from water scarce California, which we know isn't good. But I must stress that the overall, the hierarchy is pretty clear of environmental impacts from foods. And we often see that no matter how the food is produced, what you eat makes more of a difference for environmental impact than how it was produced. So yes, we have to be careful with these nuts, and we can't all in the world probably be eating 300 grams of nuts a day. But looking at the bigger picture, I think our nut intake is so low here right now in the Nordics that even doubling that, doubling a 5 gram a day to a 10 gram a day, this is not going to be the make or break thing for the environment. So lots of specific trade-offs that we need to keep our eye on, but in the big picture, we still know that moving towards that healthier diet is going to be better for the environment.
Thank you. One more question from Staffan Morild. The EAT diet has been criticized as insufficient for pregnant women, growing children, etc., regarding the iron and vitamin intake, and that there is an increased risk of deficiency.
Yeah, so I know that has been a criticism, and I think the EAT-Lancet did look at kind of this adult diet, anyone over 2 or 3, I think 2. So it didn't necessarily go into all of these more specifics, and I think that's where there's a huge role for these more regionally based analyses inspired by the EAT-Lancet to take that forward and really see, okay, what are the recommendations for specific groups? I mean, the EAT-Lancet couldn't do it all. It was supposed to be the global inspirational piece, and it was hopefully leading on to much more detailed analysis. So I would very much welcome these analysis of specific groups. I think we need to, again, make sure it's not an all or nothing. We're not saying that everyone is reducing meat to this certain amount. We can have special exceptions as long as the global average is somewhere along where we defined. And we can also look at supplementation, which I know has been a touchy subject. But from our point of view, if we don't secure this a healthy biosphere where we actually have the conditions for life, then we don't necessarily need to think about our diets because we won't survive as a species. So I guess we were a bit concerned with maintaining this underpinning health of the biosphere. But again, would very much welcome these more specific analyses looking at these specific groups.
Thank you. There is one comment from Jessica Kjellqvist here. She writes that it is a big problem with overweight because of a higher intake of nuts. So I suppose the meaning is that an increased intake of nuts causes an overweight problem. I hope
so. We do hear this quite a bit. And of course, it is a balance. So whenever you're increasing certain foods, you're decreasing other foods. So for example, we wouldn't suggest that you are increasing all the very energy dense foods. So we would assume that you're taking out something in your diet that's also energy intense. Also, again, going back to that point, when we are talking about relatively small increases in nuts and seeds, I'll take the next question as well. It's sort of the category of nuts and seeds together. We're talking about even if we double it, something like we would be eating between 10 and 15 grams of nuts a day. And I don't think compared to the other things in our diets and how much discretionary energy that we consume in our diets in the Nordics, that 15 grams of nuts is really going to be the make or break in obesity. But of course, again, we have to make sure that that we aren't eating too many and always staying within that proper energy balance for the individual.
Okay. Is sunflower seed a nut? Is there a question?
So yeah, I think we grouped the nuts and seeds together, although it's often just shorthand as nuts. So that would be sort of in the same category.
Okay, I have a question myself. I ask a bit, when you watch the EAT-Lancet planetary health diet, you see that the roots and the tubers is like a very tiny field compared to lots of the other groups. How come, and is that plausible also in the Nordic countries?
Yeah, so again, that's where these more regionally specific diet analysis come in, and we have seen in the Nordics that the roots and tubers can be, of course, higher than what the EAT-Lancet recommends, because as we've talked with different food authorities, what we see is if we would reduce our potato intake, then we would replace it with things like rice, which is maybe not so desirable from the environmental perspective as well. So of course, this can change based on cultural preferences. And the tubers from an environmental point of view, while they do have a higher impact, it's still not in that very high impact. So increasing for the Nordics would not be a problem. I'm not 100% sure, but I think one of the reasonings with this limit on the roots and tubers is because this was looking globally at diets, and we wanted to make sure, there are some populations that consume very monotonous diets that are largely these starchy vegetables, which is obviously not good for health. So it was more to set a limit to promote the diversity of foods, and also then knowing that we do have this cap of our daily energy intake. So I think there is some wiggle room around that. And I think if you look, for example, at some of the Danish dietary guidelines that are coming out, or some of the new rules that will be coming out from Livsmedelsverket, then I think you'll see that this is much more flexible in these regionally adapted diets.
Right. We have a longer question here from Pontus Danberg. It's a bit of another perspective. He writes, I read here, there is an issue with psychological health connected to overweight and the perfect body ideals. With that in mind, and the medial spin that usually circulates around weight or BMI in general, is it wise to use overweight as a discriminator for NCDs in the EAT-Lancet? Shouldn't the focus be more on cardiovascular disease, etc.?
Yeah, so I'm probably not the best to answer this question. And of course, yeah, I do hear the comment that there are other types of health issues connected with this perfect ideal body weight. So I think we do have to keep these other things in mind. I think potentially it was also used because that's just a very, when communicating to the public, it's also a very commonly understood term. But yes, I think if we actually focus in on the NCDs, then that would be a very good place to start also.
And then the last question, I wonder, which would you say, Amanda, is the biggest challenge in order to achieve this dietary shift that EAT-Lancet asks for?
Yeah, this is always a challenging question, but I actually think it's connecting the dots, particularly in working together. So I think everyone has a role in this. It's not just individuals who need to change their diets. It's not just businesses who need to give us better food on the grocery shelves. It's not just policymakers who need to enable these healthier food environments through policy and legislation. It's all together. And I think so often we are working in our silos or our sectors, and we need to move ahead pretty fast. And I think doing that together and making sure that we are achieving multiple co-benefits where we can. I think that's usually best done through collaboration. And so seeing a lot more collaboration across disciplines. I think as researchers, we have a lot of work to do in this, although starting. But really just reaching across the aisle and working together and connecting the dots between these many grand challenges that are connected to food. I think then we would start to move quite fast.
So thank you. A greater amount of collaboration across the disciplines. With that, we thank you, Amanda.
Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.